Stand by. You guys must be the new Delta team. Report.
Name's Belway. Nice to meet you, Mr. Death.
Spitbury here.
If you grew up with a PlayStation 1 in the late 90s, Fear had a very specific sound. It was the low, mechanical hum of a disc spinning up in a tray, followed by a voice that sounded like it was broadcasting from the depths of a crypt. Grown in 2 words, Resident Evil. Back then, horror wasn't about how fast you could run or how many magazines you could slide load into a rifle. It was about stillness. It was about walking into a claustrophobic hallway, hearing the wet, rhythmic thud of footsteps just out of frame, and realising you had only 3 handgun bullets left in your inventory. You didn't feel like a superhero. You felt entirely out of your depth. So when I first booted up Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, the whiplash didn't just frustrate me, it baffled me. I knew the game was in trouble long before I stopped playing it. In fact, I don't think I even made it halfway through. That's incredibly unusual for me. I've sat through some genuinely terrible games over the years, and I still pushed onto the credits out of pure stubbornness. But here, the suffocating dread was completely gone. In its place was a sprint button, a squad of tactical edgelords in gas masks, and a crosshair that didn't stop shaking. This is the exact point where me and the franchise kinda started drifting apart. It didn't feel like Resident Evil anymore. It felt like a game suffering from a massive identity crisis, a survival horror legend putting on a cheap leather jacket and trying to run with the heavy action hitters of the time. And the tragedy is, it failed at both. It failed at being a competent modern shooter, and it completely failed at being a Resident Evil game. I never played past those first few missions. I couldn't. It was an utter disappointment for someone who grew up treating Raccoon City like a physical, terrifying place. It was the worst era of the franchise, a time when Capcom looked at the creeping dread they had perfected and decided what the fans really wanted was to hip-fire assault rifles at a tyrant while sliding into cover. Welcome back to my little Resident Evil retrospective. This is the series where we are tracing the lineage of survival horror from the ground up, documenting a journey that started all the way back at the beginning, opening those giant Spencer Mansion doors back when I was 6 years old. Now, at 36, I'm returning to a destroyed Raccoon City to look at a franchise that has spent 3 decades shaping the way we experience fear. Now technically today, we are stepping outside of the standard timeline. We aren't looking at a mainline numbered entry, but if we are going to accurately document the digital archaeology of this franchise, we have to look at the scars left behind when it tried to reinvent itself. This is a detour into a very specific, chaotic moment in time, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. I've never actually hated the idea of this game. The chance to revisit the Raccoon City outbreak, see familiar events from the perspective of the Umbrella Security Service is a genuinely brilliant premise. For years, Raccoon City wasn't just a backdrop. It felt like a place with its own history and tragedies. It's the setting that completely captivated me as a kid. A playground of urban decay and creeping dread. The problem is that by the time the game arrived in 2012, the industry was obsessed with multiplayer military shooters. Call of Duty was a juggernaut, Gears of War had locked down the third-person cover system, and publishers were terrified that if their game didn't have a 4-player co-op mode, it wouldn't sell. You can almost see the corporate pitch meeting. Take one of the most beloved settings in survival horror, hand everyone an assault rifle, throw in 4-player co-op, and let the chaos do the rest. On paper, I can understand why the suit thought that would work. The trouble is, Raccoon City was never memorable because of the chaos, it was memorable because of the tension. Survival horror is a science of limitations. You know exactly how many shots a zombie can take because every bullet is a resource you had to fight to find. In Resident Evil 2, a single zombie in a narrow hallway was a crisis. In Operation Raccoon City, a zombie isn't a threat, it's a chore. The game transformed the iconic T-virus monsters into absolute bullet sponges. I still remember unloading what felt like an unreasonable amount of ammunition into a basic infected and wondering if I was missing something. The feedback never felt right. You could dump half a magazine of assault rifle rounds directly into a zombie's chest and it would just sort of jog through the lead like it was walking through heavy downpour. It completely stripped away the impact from the combat. There was no tactical feedback, no tension, just a constant repetitive rattle of automatic gunfire and a crosshair glued to an arbitrary health pool. And it wasn't just the undead. When the human Spec Ops soldiers showed up, the game descended into a deeply frustrating generic cover shooter. You'd duck behind a concrete barrier, wait for an AI enemy to poke their head out, and exchange endless streams of bullets until someone's health bar finally hit zero. It is functional enough to keep going, but never satisfying enough to become enjoyable. Slant 6 tried to borrow the mechanics of the heavy hitters of the era, but they forgot to bring the polish. The cover system was sticky, the aiming felt loose and unresponsive, and the melee combat was a chaotic mess of button mashing animations that left you completely vulnerable to getting cornered. Resident Evil had spent years creating enemies that felt memorable. The first time you encountered a licker, a hunter, or a tyrant, there was a moment of genuine uncertainty. For a kid who used to pause the game to catch his breath because a single hunter was in the next room, watching a squad of commandos slide tackle a licker felt borderline sacrilegious. The fear was gone, replaced entirely by an exhausting, noisy war of attrition. What makes Operation Raccoon City particularly frustrating is that every now and then it reminds you how good the idea was. You'll catch sights of a familiar street corner, recognise a section of Uptown, or see the outline of the RPD in the distance, and for a brief second, the game almost manages to convince you that you're about to revisit something special. That's what makes the disappointment sting. For a lot of us, Raccoon City isn't just another setting, it's probably the most important location the series has ever created. I spent so much time wandering those streets in Resident Evil 2 and 3 that they became strangely familiar, but moving through them here feels completely wrong. The original games treated the city like a tragedy. Everywhere you looked, there were signs that ordinary people had tried and failed to survive. Cold coffee cups, desperate notes left by citizens, barricaded doors and abandoned shops. There was a profound loneliness to it. Even when enemies were around, the city itself felt abandoned and quiet. Operation Raccoon City replaces a lot of that atmosphere with constant noisy activity. The lighting is harsh, the textures are muddy, and the atmospheric weight is entirely replaced by spawn points and combat arenas. You aren't exploring a ruined city, you are running between invisible trigger boxes, waiting for the game to drop another wave of generic enemies into the room so you can clear the area and open the next door. Even the fan service feels unearned. Tyrants, hunters and the nemesis make appearances, but they're never allowed to build suspense. In the older games, you often heard danger before you saw it. A distant sound, a sudden change in music, or the slow foot of heavy boots echoing through a ceiling like Mr. X in Scenario B. Your imagination did half the work. Here, everything arrives at full volume. The monsters are bigger and louder, yet somehow they feel smaller because of it. It felt like Capcom was holding up a mirror to the golden era of the franchise, but the reflection was completely warped. It was a playground built off the ruins of my favourite childhood memories, and it didn't respect the source material enough to understand why those locations mattered in the first place.
Birkin injected himself with the G-Virus. There's nothing you can do. Get out of here and make a full report to management.
What about you, sir? I lost the sample. I'm going back for it.
If you didn't have 3 friends willing to jump into Operation Raccoon City with you, the game forced you to play with the computer-controlled squad mates. And to this day, I think it features some of the most spectacularly broken AI ever programmed into a major release. The AI squad mates that accompany you through the campaign never felt like trained Umbrella operatives. They felt like a collective suicide pact, a group of people who had agreed that self-preservation was someone else's responsibility. They would regularly wander into danger, walk directly into active fire traps, stand completely still while a zombie chewed on the neck, or sprint straight into the line of fire of a Spec Ops turret. You'd spend half your resources just trying to revive them off the floor, not because you needed their help, but because you were stuck supervising a group project where nobody else had done the reading. It stopped feeling like you were leading a squad and started feeling like managing enemy aggro entirely on your own was less exhausting than dealing with them. There is a moment early in the campaign where you have to navigate an area filled with biohazards and infected blood. Watching your AI squad mates mindlessly pathfind right into the middle of a crowd of monsters, completely ignoring cover, strategy or self-preservation, sums up the entire single-player experience. It was a game designed for a multiplayer market that forgot to ensure the solo experience was even functional. When a game is this frustrating to actually play, the narrative doesn't matter. The alternative history angle, the chance to hunt down Leon, loses all its weight when the mechanical act of moving from room to room feels like wrestling with a machine that doesn't want you to succeed. The shooting felt average, the enemies felt repetitive, and the squad mechanics felt completely undeveloped. It wanted to be a squad shooter, it wanted to be a Resident Evil game, and it wanted to be an alternate history story, but it never seemed completely sure which of those ideas should come first. Eventually, the novelty wore off, the repetition and the sheer lack of identity broke me, and I did what I almost never do. I just paused, turned the console off, and walked away. I simply reached the point where I realised I wasn't enjoying myself. And for a Resident Evil game, that's probably the most disappointing outcome imaginable. Every long-running franchise has its dark ages, but the early 2010s were a uniquely painful time to be a Resident Evil purist. We were caught in a no man's land between the brilliance of the old-school survival horror design and a corporate directive to turn everything into an arcade blockbuster. You could see that tension building for years. Resident Evil 4 had been a masterpiece, but it was also a turning point where balancing horror and action became a tightrope walk. Resident Evil 5 pushed further into a spectacle, and while plenty of people loved it, it was the point where a lot of long-time fans started asking where the horror had gone. Then Operation Raccoon City arrived right in the middle of that uncertainty, completely dropping the ball while trying to chase what the rest of the industry was doing. It felt like the survival horror genre itself was being treated as an archaic relic, something that belonged strictly in the 90s, left behind on the original PlayStation hardware. The industry had decided that slow pacing, fixed cameras, and deliberate restraint were dead. But Operation Raccoon City stands as the definitive proof of what happens when a franchise loses its soul to chase a trend. It tried to keep up with the heavy action hitters, but it didn't have the mechanical polish to compete with them on their own turf. And it completely alienated the fans who had been opening those heavy Spencer Mansion doors since 1996. Trends have a habit of aging incredibly fast. while identities remain timeless. When I look back at the original games, I don't think about what was popular in 1996, I think about the atmosphere. Operation Raccoon City feels completely tied to a specific corporate moment in gaming history, where publishers became convinced that every franchise needed to appeal to the exact same audience in roughly the same way. It's a design philosophy built entirely on compromise, and in the end, nobody won. It wasn't scary enough for the horror crowd, and it wasn't tight enough for the shooter crowd. It sits in the archive not as a hidden gem or as an underrated experiment, but as a warning sign, a monument to the era where the franchise forgot exactly what made it legendary in the first place. The funny thing about looking back at Operation Raccoon City from 2026 is that it doesn't really make me angry anymore. Hindsight has a habit of changing the way you look at things, and the reason this game is easier to talk about now is because we already know how the story ends. We know Resident Evil wasn't permanently lost. Capcom eventually realised that you can only run away from your foundations for so long before the whole structure collapses. Years later, Resident Evil 7 would strip the action away entirely, returning the series to a quiet, claustrophobic nightmare. And the modern remakes would prove that the meticulous, tense pacing of the RPD was exactly what players wanted all along. So in a weird way, I'm glad Operation Raccoon City exists. It was the rock bottom the franchise needed to hit to remember its identity. You can't simply take a beloved series, strip away the things that made people care about it, and expect the name alone to carry the experience. Resident Evil survived because eventually it remembered that. Consider this expansion entry documented. If you got your own memories of Operation Raccoon City, good or bad, let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely love to know whether anyone managed to get more out of it than I did. And if you want to make sure your inventory is locked in for the next room, hit the like button and subscribe to secure your place in the squad. If you're just dropping in, I've got the full retrospective locked into a single playlist, tracking every step of this journey all the way back to opening those big heavy Spencer Mansion doors in 1996. A massive thank you to the channel members Joe Peacock, Ross McKellar and Callum MacDonald for supporting the channel. Your support keeps this archive growing, one game at a time. We've acknowledged the scar, we've documented the drift, and now it's time to double down on the horror, except next time, the horror isn't just happening on screen, it's the game itself. Next time in the retrospective, we are staying firmly in the era of Capcom's identity crisis, because if Operation Raccoon City was the warning sign, what comes next is the full-blown pile-up. Resident Evil 6 is waiting. I'll see you on the next one.
Stay right where you are. Mr. President!